The desert breathes at night. When the last tour bus rumbles away from the Giza plateau and the floodlights dim, something older stirs in the silence. The wind moves across limestone that has stood for millennia, carrying with it the whisper of sand against stone, a sound unchanged since before the first pharaoh claimed dominion over the Nile. Above, the stars blaze with desert clarity, arranging themselves in patterns that ancient eyes once studied with reverence and purpose. Here, beneath constellations that have wheeled overhead for countless centuries, the Great Pyramid rises like a geometric mountain against the night sky. Its edges, once clad in polished white Tura limestone that caught moonlight and scattered it across the valley below, now show the weathered bones of inner construction. Yet even stripped of its outer glory, the monument commands a presence that transcends architecture. It stands not merely as stone upon stone, but as a question carved into the very surface of the earth. What if these blocks remember? Not in the way human memory functions, fragile, selective, prone to revision, but in the way geology remembers, through pressure, through weight, through the patient recording of time itself. Each stone bears the marks of its quarrying, transportation, and placement. Some show tool marks that speak to copper chisels and patient human hands. Others display precision that troubles modern engineers, cuts so exact they suggest knowledge we assume ancient peoples could not possess. The night wind knows no archaeology, respects no chronology. It moves through the same channels it carved 10,000 years ago, indifferent to the names we give to ages or the narratives we construct to explain the inexplicable. And as darkness deepens over Giza, the pyramids become what they perhaps always were, not answers, but invitations to wonder. This is where our journey begins, not with certainty, but with the recognition that the desert holds secrets deeper than sand, and that some monuments were ancient before history learned to write its own name. Long before the first hieroglyph was carved into temple walls, the Nile Valley told a different story. Picture a landscape transformed, where today's Sahara stretches in parched monotony. Imagine instead a mosaic of seasonal grasslands stippled with acacia groves. Where modern tourists photograph camels against dunes, envision instead waterways threading between verdant patches, supporting herds of animals that would seem impossibly out of place in today's Egypt. Giraffes, elephants, wild cattle moving in seasonal patterns, dictated by rains that fell with regularity unimaginable to later dynasties. This was the Egypt of deep prehistory, a place where the Nile ran fuller, and the climate patterns of North Africa had not yet shifted toward the arid extreme we now consider normal. The people who lived here left no written records, built no cities that survived the ages in recognizable form. Yet they were not primitive. They were observers, problem solvers, inheritors of knowledge passed down through generations of experimentation with their environment. Archaeological sites across Egypt's western desert reveal Neolithic settlements dating back 9,000 years and beyond, communities that thrived when the Sahara was green, when rainfall supported seasonal lakes and permanent springs. These people created pottery, domesticated animals, and developed sophisticated understanding of their landscape's rhythms. They watched the same stars that would later be incorporated into pyramid alignments. They tracked the Nile's floods with the precision that would eventually become the foundation of Egyptian agriculture and religious calendar alike. But here's the troubling question that conventional chronology struggles to accommodate. What if those watchers built in stone as well as in wood and reed? What if the impulse to create monuments, to mark the landscape with intentional geometry, emerged not in the dynastic period we celebrate, but in this earlier, wetter world that preceded it by thousands of years? The standard narrative places the pyramids firmly in the Old Kingdom, beginning around 2630 BCE with Djoser's Step Pyramid at Saqqara. This timeline is supported by carbon dating, historical records, and the archaeological consensus built over more than a century of scholarship. Yet certain anomalies persist, certain questions that refuse convenient answers. the weathering patterns on the Sphinx, the precision of the Great Pyramid's construction, the absence of inscriptions inside Khufu's monument itself, despite the Egyptian love of proclaiming royal achievement. Could Giza be the surface evidence of something older, a complex inherited and adapted by dynasties that came later, who found these monuments already ancient and claimed them as their own? The idea sounds radical until you consider how often later cultures have appropriated earlier achievements. How temples were built atop temples, how Roman emperors inscribed their names on Egyptian obelisks carved millennia before Rome existed, how medieval Christians converted pagan sites into churches. History is written by those who remember, or claim to remember, and memory is notoriously willing to reshape the past into forms that serve the present. Meanwhile, beneath the desert stars, the stones themselves remain silent on the question of their true age. The Sphinx gazes east, its leonine body stretching 73 meters from paw to tail, its human face, though weathered nearly beyond recognition, still holding the posture of eternal watch. For centuries, this monument was buried to its neck in sand, revealed only in periodic excavations that exposed the limestone. Body to the same question that troubles geologists to this day. What carved these vertical fissures into the Sphinx's flanks? The controversy centers on weathering patterns that don't match the expected signature of wind erosion. Wind sculpts limestone into horizontal features, exploiting layers of differential hardness to create the characteristic banding visible throughout the Giza Plateau. But the Sphinx displays something else entirely: deep vertical channels and undulating surfaces that water, specifically substantial rainfall, typically produces. Geologist Robert Schoch brought this observation to wider attention in the 1990s, though Egyptian geologists and engineers had noted the peculiar weathering decades earlier. Schoch's analysis suggested that the Sphinx enclosure showed evidence of water erosion requiring not occasional storms, but sustained rainfall over considerable time. The kind of rainfall that Egypt hasn't experienced in the Holocene epoch, not since the end of the African humid period, which concluded around 3000 BCE in Lower Egypt, though some regions dried much earlier. If the weathering indeed requires prolonged exposure to significant rainfall, the Sphinx's construction would need to be pushed back into periods when such climate conditions existed. This creates immediate tension with Orthodox chronology, which attributes the monument to Khufu around 2500 BCE. The counter-arguments are substantial. Egyptologists point to stylistic features linking the Sphinx's face to 4th Dynasty royal portraiture. They note the absence of any hieroglyphic or archaeological evidence suggesting earlier construction. Other geologists argue that the weathering patterns can be explained through a combination of wind, sand, moisture wicking from the water table, and the differential hardness of the limestone layers from which the Sphinx was carved. Yet the vertical channels remain, carved into stone that sits in an enclosure dug deep into the plateau itself. The debate has polarized into camps, not merely about erosion mechanics, but about what kinds of evidence we privilege when reconstructing the past. Do we trust the stones themselves, reading in their surfaces the story of climates that shaped them? Or do we trust the human record, incomplete as it may be, that places construction firmly in the dynastic period? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere between these positions. Perhaps the Sphinx has been reworked, its face recarved, its body modified by dynasties that found it already weathered and ancient. Perhaps the monument we see today is a palimpsest, carrying evidence of multiple ages, multiple intentions, like a manuscript that has been written over but never fully erased. As centuries of sand blow across the Sphinx's scarred flanks, the erosion continues its patient work, gradually wearing away the evidence that might resolve the debate once and for all. Between 15,000 and 5,000 years ago, the Sahara transformed. What is now the world's largest hot desert became a landscape unrecognizable to modern eyes, a patchwork of grasslands, woodlands, and interconnected lakes fed by monsoon systems that penetrated far north of their current range. This period, known to climate scientists as the African humid period or the Holocene wet phase, fundamentally altered North Africa's ecology and human geography. Rivers flowed where today there is only sand. Hippopotamuses wallowed in waters that have since vanished. People settled, fished, herded, and carved petroglyphs into rocks that now stand isolated in parched emptiness. The transformation was driven by orbital mechanics, subtle shifts in Earth's axial tilt and orbital eccentricity that altered the distribution of solar radiation reaching the planet's surface. These Milankovitch cycles occur over tens of thousands of years, gradually pushing climate zones north or south, intensifying or weakening seasonal patterns. During the African humid period, the West African monsoon system strengthened and expanded, bringing summer rains deep into territories that today receive almost no precipitation. For the Nile Valley, this meant a different relationship between river and desert. The Nile itself ran higher and more consistently, fed by enhanced rainfall across its Ethiopian and East African headwaters. But crucially, the lands flanking the river were not the stark barrier they would later become. The transition between river valley and open desert was gradual, permeable, supporting seasonal movement and cultural exchange across regions that later centuries would experience as hostile wasteland. This was the world in which pre-dynastic Egyptian culture developed, a world where water was abundant enough to support not just survival, but the kind of surplus that enables specialization, monument building, and the transmission of complex knowledge. Yet it was also a world that was ending. Around 5,000 years ago, the rains began to fail. The process wasn't instantaneous. It unfolded over centuries, with periods of renewed moisture alternating with increasingly severe dry phases. But the trajectory was clear. The Sahara was desiccating, the grasslands retreating, the lakes evaporating. Human populations faced a choice: adapt to increasing aridity, migrate toward remaining water sources, or perish. Many moved toward the Nile, swelling the valley's population and intensifying the pressure to develop organized irrigation, centralized food storage, and eventually the administrative apparatus we recognize as civilization. The unification of Upper and Lower Egypt around 3100 BCE may have been as much a response to climate stress as to political ambition, a consolidation forced by the narrowing of habitable zones into the river corridor itself. But what of those who lived through the earlier, wetter phases? What of the cultures that thrived when water was abundant, when the plateau itself received rainfall that carved channels and wore down limestone? Did they build? Did they observe the stars and attempt to encode their knowledge in forms that might outlast the climate that sustained them? The geological evidence suggests they had time. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx, if indeed they require sustained rainfall, could have been formed during the tail end of the African humid period, when Lower Egypt still received enough precipitation to carve rock over centuries of exposure. This would push the monument's origins back before the dynastic period, into the realm of Neolithic cultures we know primarily through stone tools and pottery shards. It's a speculative timeline, contested and controversial. Yet it aligns with a broader pattern visible across the ancient world. Wherever climate shifted and water became scarce, human societies faced existential pressure. Some collapsed. Others adapted and built civilizations whose monuments would outlast the memory of what came before. The rain that fell on Giza carved more than stone. It carved the boundary between prehistory and history, between forgotten builders and the dynasties that claimed their legacy. In the official chronicle of Egypt's glory, the Great Pyramid belongs to Khufu. Known to the Greeks as Cheops, Khufu ruled during the 4th dynasty, approximately 2589 to 2566 BCE, in a period of extraordinary cultural and technological achievement. His father, Sneferu, had already pushed pyramid construction to unprecedented scales, building at least 3 massive monuments, including the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid at the shore. Khufu inherited not just a kingdom, but a technological tradition, a workforce organization system, and the religious mandate to build his own eternal resting place on a scale that would surpass all predecessors. The construction of the Great Pyramid, according to mainstream Egyptology, was an exercise in state power channeled through religious devotion. Khufu commanded resources across Egypt, limestone quarried from the plateau itself, finer Tura limestone brought from across the Nile for casing stones, granite transported from Aswan 600 miles south. Tens of thousands of workers, not slaves, as Victorian romantics imagined, but seasonal laborers, skilled craftsmen, and permanent core crews, spent roughly 20 years cutting, moving, and placing an estimated 2.3 million blocks. The organizational achievement rivals the engineering feat. Workers needed food, water, housing, tools, medical care, and supervision. Quarries required constant operation. Transport routes, both overland and via the Nile's flood season, demanded coordination. The pyramid itself required not just piling stones, but maintaining precise angles, ensuring structural integrity as the mass grew, and incorporating internal passages, chambers, and the shafts whose purpose still sparks debate. Hieroglyphic marks discovered inside the pyramid's relieving chambers, spaces built above the king's sea, chamber to distribute weight, bear Khufu's aim. These weren't meant for public display. They're workers' marks, the ancient equivalent of construction graffiti, using red ochre to note which crew handled which blocks. To Egyptologists, they're powerful evidence linking the monument directly to Khufu's reign. The broader archaeological context supports this attribution. The Giza complex includes not just the 3 main pyramids, but also smaller Queen's pyramids, mortuary temples, causeways, and the remains of workers' villages. The site represents a coherent 4th dynasty architectural program, with stylistic and construction technique continuities connecting it to both earlier and later monuments. The mastaba tombs of nobles and officials who served Khufu surround the Great Pyramid, forming an acropolis that makes sense only if the central monument dates to the same period. This is the comfortable narrative. Pyramids as pharaonic statements, built by human hands for human ambition, cloaked in divine purpose. It requires no lost civilizations, no mysterious technologies, no uncomfortable revisions to timelines painstakingly assembled through generations of scholarship. The pyramids become explicable, products of a society we can study through texts, artifacts, and the material remains of daily life. Yet even within this orthodox framework, mysteries persist. Why does the Great Pyramid contain no inscriptions in its main chambers, when later pyramids are covered in pyramid texts describing the pharaoh's journey to the afterlife? Why is the sarcophagus in the king's chamber unfinished and uninscribed? Why do Greek historians, writing 2,000 years after Khufu, report Egyptian priest traditions, claiming the monuments were far older than Greek or even Egyptian records suggested? The pharaonic narrative explains much. It accounts for the construction methods, the workforce organization, the positioning within a broader 4th dynasty building program. But it struggles with anomalies that point towards something more complex, either in the monuments, construction history, or in what they represented to the cultures that built and rebuilt around them. Centuries after Khufu's death, later pharaohs would inscribe their names on monuments they did not build, claiming credit for achievements that preceded them. Egypt's history is full of such appropriations, each dynasty rewriting the past to legitimate the present. What if Khufu himself engaged in the same practice, not building the Great Pyramid from foundation to capstone, but instead restoring, completing, or monumentally modifying something that already stood ancient on the plateau? Consider an alternative reading of the evidence, not as contradiction, but as complication. What if the Great Pyramid as we encounter it today is not the product of a single construction phase, but rather a palimpsest, an original structure modified, encased, and elaborated by Old Kingdom pharaohs who found on the Giza plateau not empty bedrock, but ruins already weathered by ages their own records could not account for? This inheritance hypothesis doesn't require rejecting the archaeological evidence linking Khufu to Giza. Instead, it reframes that evidence: the workers' marks, the surrounding tombs, the mortuary complex, all genuine products of 4th Dynasty activity, but representing restoration and completion rather than original construction. In this reading, Khufu's achievement was not creating the Great Pyramid, but claiming it, recasing its exterior, excavating and modifying its interior passages, and inscribing his name in places that would forever associate the monument with his reign. The idea finds subtle support in Egyptian texts themselves. The inventory stela, discovered in the 19th century near the Great Pyramid, describes Khufu ordering restoration work around the Sphinx, which it claims already existed in his father's time. Though most Egyptologists consider this stela a later fabrication, possibly from the 26th dynasty, when Egypt was experiencing a revival of interest. In its archaic past, it reflects a persistent tradition that the Giza monuments predated the pharaohs credited with building them. Similar patterns appear elsewhere in Egyptian history. Ramesses II, the great builder king of the 19th dynasty, inscribed his cartouche on temples and statues created centuries or even millennia before his birth, claiming them as his own work. The practice was so common that Egyptologists must carefully distinguish between original construction dates and later attribution attempts. If Ramesses could appropriate the works of earlier dynasties, why not Khufu, appropriating the works of cultures that left no written records at all? The hypothesis gains additional traction when examining the stark differences between the Great Pyramid and other Old Kingdom structures. Later pyramids, though monumental, never matched Giza's precision. None achieved the same megalithic scale in their core blocks. None incorporated the same degree of astronomical alignment. Later dynasties built faster, cruder, with smaller stones and less sophisticated internal architecture. The trajectory, oddly, is not toward improvement, but toward decline, as if the 4th dynasty possessed knowledge that was already being lost, even as they worked. This pattern suggests not technological evolution, but inheritance. Builders working from plans or prototypes they partially understood, reproducing what they could, but losing refinements with each iteration. Apprentices who learned the techniques, but not the underlying principles. Craftsmen who could copy, but not innovate at the same level. If the Great Pyramid was indeed far older, Khufu's modification would have been an act of historical consolidation, taking credit for antiquity in order to link his dynasty to an authority deeper than mere conquest or succession could provide. Such strategies are common across cultures. Medieval kings claimed descent from Troy's heroes. Chinese emperors traced their legitimacy to mythical sage kings. The pharaohs of the Old Kingdom, confronted with monuments their own traditions could barely explain, may have done the same, adopted them, restored them, and inscribed them into a narrative that made these ancient stones extensions of royal divine power. But if this hypothesis holds, who were the original builders? And when did they work? The answer lies not in written records, which capture only the tail end of human history, but in the stones themselves and in the climatic record carved into the landscape. It lies in the rain that fell when Egypt was younger, when the plateau was not yet desert, when cultures we know only through scattered artifacts moved across a greener world and perhaps, just perhaps, built monuments meant to outlast the water that sustained them. The inheritance hypothesis doesn't solve the mystery of Giza. Rather, it deepens it, suggesting that the pyramids are older than history and that what we call Egyptian civilization emerged not from nothing, but from the ruins of something else, something the desert consumed before writing could preserve its name. History is full of impossibilities made real by sand's preserving patience. In 1922, Italian archaeologist Achille Valgagliano excavated a Roman merchant vessel in Egypt's western desert, not buried near the ancient coast, but nearly 200 kilometers inland, far from any water source that could plausibly have floated cargo. The ship, dating to the 2nd or 3rd century CE, had been dismantled and buried deliberately, surrounded by amphorae and cargo goods. In what appeared to be a ritual deposit, or perhaps an offering to gods of a sea that had never touched that inland location. How did a Roman ship end up hundreds of miles from navigable water? The prosaic explanation involves overland transport. The vessel was likely carried in pieces as part of a desert trade caravan, then interred at a remote oasis or ceremonial site. Romans traded extensively across Egypt's deserts, moving goods between Nile settlements and distant outposts, sometimes portaging boats across waterless stretches to reach isolated bodies of water. The discovery, while unusual, fits within known patterns of Roman logistical determination. Yet the image haunts, a ship swallowed by sand, preserved in aridity, waiting nearly 2 millennia for excavators to reveal its impossible presence. It speaks to how landscapes transform, how the seemingly permanent dissolves into something unrecognizable, how our assumptions about where things belong can blind us to what actually was. Egypt's sands are full of such improbabilities. Tombs that should have been looted centuries ago emerge intact, their treasures preserved through quirks of geology and fortune. Cities that thrived in antiquity now sit buried under dunes, their foundations resting on water tables that have since dropped dozens of meters. Marine fossils, ancient sea creatures turned to stone, lie embedded in the limestone blocks of the pyramids themselves, proof that the plateau was once ocean floor, long before humans walked upright. This is the challenge confronting anyone attempting to reconstruct Egypt's deep past. The landscape itself is a palimpsest written in stone, sand and water, where each layer tells a story that contradicts the present. The desert's sterility is recent. The dryness is temporary. What seems permanent is merely the latest iteration of cycles that have transformed North Africa repeatedly over hundreds of thousands of years. A Roman ship in the desert reminds us that context is everything, and that context can vanish completely within geological timeframes. The water that carved the Sphinx's enclosure doesn't flow today. The rains that fed the African humid period are absent from modern climate models of the region. The cultures that thrived when Egypt was green left behind scattered tools and rock art, but little that survives in the catastrophically arid landscape that replaced their world. If Roman ships can end up buried in sand, if seas can rise and fall, leaving only fossils as memory, if entire climate zones can shift and render landscapes unrecognizable, what else might the desert conceal? What other impossibilities wait beneath the dunes, preserved by the same patient aridity that mummified pharaohs and saved papyrus texts for millennia? The sands are deep. The timescales are vaster than human intuition can easily grasp. And every excavation reveals not clarity, but complexity, layers upon layers of occupation, abandonment, transformation, and return. The ship reminds us, everything is temporary, and the desert forgets nothing. Inside the Great Pyramid's king's chamber, granite beams weighing up to 80 tons stretch overhead, precisely fitted into a ceiling designed to support the monument's crushing mass. The granite itself came from Aswan, 600 miles south, quarried from bedrock, transported by river barge during flood season, then somehow raised and positioned within the pyramid's interior with tolerances measured in millimeters. Each beam is a marvel of ancient engineering, but it's the smaller details that trouble modern researchers. The drill holes, the saw marks, the precision joinery that suggests capabilities current understanding of Bronze Age technology struggles to explain. Consider the diorite bowls found in early dynastic contexts across Egypt, vessels carved from one of the hardest stones accessible to ancient quarrymen, shaped with walls so thin and symmetrical they approach the tolerances of modern machining. Diorite registers 7 on the Mohs hardness scale, harder than the copper chisels and saws Egyptologists identify as the primary tools available to Old Kingdom craftsmen. Yet somehow, ancient workers produced diorite vessels with interiors hollowed to eggshell thinness, with necks too narrow for human hands to reach inside, with surfaces polished to reflective smoothness. The standard explanation involves patience. Copper tools used in combination with sand or corundum as cutting abrasive, applied over weeks or months of grinding labor. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated this method can work, though the time investment is staggering. Yet questions remain about specific features. The precision of certain drill cores extracted from granite blocks, showing spiral grooves that suggest feed rates seemingly incompatible with manual drilling. The flatness of stone surfaces that rivals modern machined tolerances. The tight joinery of massive blocks fitted so precisely that knife blades cannot penetrate the seams. Christopher Dunn, a machinist who has studied Giza's stonework with an engineer's eye, argues that some features display characteristics consistent with advanced tooling, tubular drilling, precision sawing, and geometric accuracy that suggest not just hand tools, but systematic approaches we associate with machine-age manufacturing. His analysis, while controversial, highlights a genuine puzzle. The stones show evidence of techniques we can describe, but cannot fully replicate using only the tools Orthodox archaeology attributes to Old Kingdom Egypt. Does this mean the ancient builders possessed lost technologies? Power tools, diamond-tipped drills, methods lost when their civilization collapsed? Or does it mean we've underestimated what patience, skill, and accumulated generational knowledge can achieve with apparently primitive tools? The answer likely lies between these extremes. Human capability, especially when refined across generations of specialized practice, can achieve astonishing results. Master craftsmen working within traditions that prized precision and invested decades in training could produce work that seems impossible to modern observers accustomed to machine assistance. The Japanese temple carpenters who fit wooden beams without nails, the medieval stonemasons who carved cathedrals with hand tools, the Polynesian navigators who crossed oceans without instruments, all demonstrate that human skill can transcend our assumptions about what is possible with primitive technology. Yet some anomalies resist comfortable explanation. The granite cores extracted from Aswan show drilling that penetrated rock at rates difficult to reconcile with manual pressure alone. The casing stones originally covering the Great Pyramid were fitted with gaps averaging just 0.5 millimeters across surfaces, measuring several square meters, precision comparable to modern optical instruments. The interior passages are cut through limestone with a straightness that seems to require sophisticated surveying techniques. Yet no evidence of those techniques survives. Perhaps the answer is simpler than lost civilizations or impossible technologies. Perhaps we're re-looking at the pinnacle of human craftwork, the accumulated expertise of cultures that invested everything in stone. Egypt's entire religious worldview centered on permanence, on defeating time through architecture. A civilization that believed stone was the path to immortality would naturally develop stone-working traditions refined beyond what later cultures, building in wood or brick, would ever achieve. Or perhaps the stones remember methods we've forgotten, not because they were impossible, but because the knowledge was oral, transmitted master to apprentice, and lost when the chains of transmission broke. The tools lie silent in museum cases. The craftsman's secrets died with them, and the stones endure, precisely cut and impossibly old, asking questions with every joint and drill mark. Giza's precision stonework is not unique. Across the ancient world, scattered monuments display craftsmanship that challenges our assumptions about technological progression. In Peru, the megalithic walls of Sacsayhuaman feature limestone blocks weighing up to 200 tons, fitted together with such precision that their curved, irregular surfaces interlock like three-dimensional puzzles. No mortar binds them, yet the joints are so tight that erosion over centuries has not dislodged them. In Lebanon, the trilithons of Baalbek, three massive stone blocks forming part of a Roman temple foundation, weigh an estimated 800 tons each. Nearby in the quarry lies the stone of the pregnant woman, a single hewn block weighing approximately 1,000 tons, abandoned mid-extraction. The Romans certainly built the temple, but some researchers argue the trilithon platform predates Roman occupation, suggesting earlier builders with capabilities that exceed our understanding of ancient engineering. At Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, pillars carved with animal reliefs stand in circular arrangements, dated to 11,000 years ago, millennia before agriculture, before pottery, before metal tools. The site rewrites assumptions about what pre-agricultural societies could achieve, demonstrating that monumental architecture and sophisticated symbolic thought emerged earlier than previously imagined. These parallels suggest not a single lost super-civilization that built across continents, but rather a persistent human capability. Given sufficient motivation, time, and accumulated knowledge, societies at various stages of technological development could and did achieve feats that later cultures struggle to explain or reproduce. The phrase lost technology often conjures images of ancient laser cutters or anti-gravity devices, but the reality is probably more prosaic and more impressive. The truly lost technologies were likely techniques, knowledge about leverage, material properties, organizational methods, and most importantly, patience. Ancient builders worked within different time horizons than modern contractors. A project spanning generations wasn't failure. It was normal. Knowledge could accumulate across centuries, with each generation refining methods and passing expertise to the next. Consider the Egyptian knowledge of stone properties, which limestone layers fractured easily, which held edges, which could be polished smooth. This knowledge came from millennia of working quarries, learning through trial and error which beds produced the best building stone. No textbook recorded it. It lived in the hands and eyes of quarrymen who could read stone the way sailors read water. Or consider organizational technologies, the bureaucratic innovations required to feed, house, and coordinate tens of thousands of workers across decades of construction. Egypt's administrative sophistication, documented in papyri and tomb inscriptions, was itself a technology, the technology of collective human effort directed toward multi-generational goals. Modern construction companies, working within quarterly profit cycles, have arguably lost this capability as thoroughly as they've lost the secret of fitting granite blocks with millimeter precision. The most important lost technology may be cultural, the willingness to invest in projects whose completion no living person would see, the transmission of specialized knowledge through apprenticeship systems that took decades to produce masters, the societal agreement that permanence mattered more than efficiency. Yet even accounting for cultural differences and accumulated expertise, certain features remain enigmatic. The precision isn't merely impressive, it's unnecessary for structural purposes, suggesting it served symbolic or ritual functions we no longer understand. Why fit casing stones so precisely when rougher work would have supported the pyramid's weight just as well? Why drill cores deep into granite when shallower cuts would have achieved the same quarrying result? Perhaps precision itself was the message. Perhaps the monuments were meant to demonstrate not just power or piety, but capability, proof that the builders understood principles of geometry, engineering, and material science at levels that commanded respect and wonder. The pyramids as statements not just about the pharaohs, but about human potential itself. Across the world, these monuments endure as questions carved in stone. The techniques that created them, whether lost through conquest, climate disruption, or the simple erosion of oral tradition, remain tantalizingly out of reach, challenging each generation to either rediscover the methods or admit that humanity's technological journey has not been the simple upward climb we like to imagine. Meanwhile, the stones themselves wait, fitted with impossible precision, asking how patience and purpose can achieve what machines and modern methods struggle to match. 70,000 years ago, Egypt shivered. The planet had entered a glacial phase, the most recent advance of ice sheets that would dominate the northern hemisphere for tens of millennia. Though Egypt itself remained ice-free, too far south and too arid for glaciation, the climate impacts were profound. Global sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters as water locked into continental ice sheets. The Nile, fed by different rainfall patterns and flowing through a landscape altered by cooler temperatures, carved channels that modern surveys reveal lying beneath the current riverbed. This was a different world, cooler, drier in some regions, but paradoxically wetter in others, as atmospheric circulation patterns shifted around the massive ice masses to the north. The Mediterranean coastline lay kilometers seaward of its current position. The Sahara, though not lush, experienced different moisture regimes than today, with some models suggesting increased winter rainfall when summer monsoons weakened. Human populations in Egypt during this period were sparse, mobile, leaving behind stone tools and the traces of temporary camps, but little else. These were hunter-gatherers, following game and seasonal resources across a landscape that offered survival but little surplus. Yet they were anatomically modern humans, cognitively identical to ourselves, capable of complex thought, symbolic reasoning, and sophisticated social organization. What knowledge did they accumulate during those long millennia? What observations of the sky, the seasons, the behavior of animals, and the properties of stone? We assume that civilization begins with agriculture and cities, but consciousness and curiosity long predate settled life. For tens of thousands of years, humans observed, experimented, and transmitted knowledge through oral tradition, knowledge that left no written record, but may have encoded itself in other ways. Rock art appears in Africa, dating back more than 40,000 years. Ochre use, suggesting symbolic behavior, extends back even further. The cognitive revolution that allowed humans to conceive of gods, tell stories, and plan across seasons occurred deep in the Paleolithic. By the time the glacial maximum began releasing its grip 15,000 years ago, human societies had accumulated enormous stores of practical wisdom, tracking skills, material knowledge, astronomical observations, medicinal plant uses, social organizational strategies. Did any of this knowledge find expression in more permanent forms? Could nomadic peoples, moving seasonally across a landscape, have marked sacred sites with stones, aligned to celestial events, creating proto-monuments that later societies would elaborate and formalize? Göbekli Tepe suggests they could. That site's oldest layers date to 11,600 years ago, built by people who are still pre-agricultural, but who clearly possessed organizational capacity and symbolic sophistication to quarry, transport, carve, and erect massive stone pillars. If such capabilities existed in Anatolia at the end of the Ice Age, why not in Egypt as well? The problem is preservation. Wood, leather, fiber, the materials mobile peoples use, decay completely within centuries in most environments. Stone circles, carved bedrock, and quarried monuments survive, but only if they are substantial enough to resist erosion, and only if later peoples do and dismantle them for building material. Much of what Ice Age humans might have created has been erased by the subsequent 10 millennia of climate change, sea level rise, river migration, and cultural transformation. Yet the landscape itself remembers. Geologists reading climate proxies from lake cores, cave formations, and ancient shorelines reconstruct a story of dramatic environmental shifts. The Nile's discharge patterns, the Sahara's moisture levels, the Mediterranean's coastline, all changed radically as the ice retreated and global circulation patterns reorganized. Communities that had adapted to glacial conditions faced rapid transformation. New coastlines, altered river courses, shifting resource distributions. Some adapted, some migrated, and some perhaps attempted to preserve their knowledge in forms that might outlast catastrophe, not in writing, which hadn't been invented, but in stone oriented to stars, whose patterns remained constant even as the Earth's climate lurched through transformations. This is speculation built on fragments, geological evidence, scattered artifacts, and the knowledge that humans have always sought to make meaning from chaos and permanence from change. But it is speculation grounded in a fundamental recognition. The people who lived through the Ice Age as end were us. Their minds worked as ours do. Their impulse to understand, commemorate, and transmit knowledge was no less powerful for lacking alphabets and papyrus. As the ice retreated and Egypt warmed, the stage was set for the transformations that would eventually produce pharaohs and pyramids. But the curtain had risen long before on actors whose names we'll never know, performing in a drama whose script was written in stone and star, and the patient accumulation of human observation across ages longer than history can remember. And then, suddenly, the warming stopped. Approximately 12,900 years ago, just as the planet seemed committed to interglacial warmth, climate shifted dramatically. Within decades, perhaps within a single human lifetime, temperatures plunged back toward glacial conditions. Ice sheets that had been retreating began advancing again. Ecosystems that had adapted to warming were thrown into chaos. The event, known as the Younger Dryas, after a tundra wildflower whose pollen marks the period in European cores, lasted roughly 1,300 years. For regions near the ice sheets, the impact was catastrophic. Forests reverted to tundra. Animals adapted to warming conditions faced sudden cold. Human populations, already stressed by rapid environmental change, now confronted what must have seemed like the world ending, a return of the ice that promised permanent winter. Egypt, distant from the ice margins, experienced the Younger Dryas differently. Not as glacial advance, but as further aridification and disrupted monsoon patterns. The African humid period, which would eventually transform the Sahara into grassland, was delayed. The Nile's discharge patterns shifted. Communities dependent on predictable seasonal resources faced unpredictability. The cause of the Younger Dryas remains debated. The leading hypothesis involves meltwater from collapsing North American ice sheets disrupting Atlantic Ocean circulation, shutting down the Gulf Stream's heat transport to northern Europe. An alternative, more controversial theory points to extraterrestrial impact, a comet or asteroid fragmenting in Earth's atmosphere, triggering widespread fires, atmospheric cooling, and possibly contributing to the extinction of Ice Age megafauna. Whatever the mechanism, the consequences were global. Sediment cores from around the world show the signature, a sudden return to cooler, drier conditions that interrupted the glacial to interglacial transition. Species extinctions accelerated. In the Near East, some researchers argue the climate stress of the Younger Dryas pushed human communities toward agriculture, forced experimentation with plant cultivation when wild resources became unpredictable. But what of communities that had begun to build, to settle, to create permanent works? If the Younger Dryas struck a world where early humans had started erecting stone monuments or establishing proto-settlements, those achievements would have been vulnerable. A society dependent on specific climate conditions, predictable rains, stable coastlines, particular ecological niches, would face collapse when those conditions vanished. This is where alternative theories about pre-dynastic or even pre-Holocene civilizations collide with catastrophism. If advanced societies existed before the Younger Dryas, the event could have disrupted them so thoroughly that only scattered remnants survived. Knowledge degraded to myth monuments weathered, and buried populations dispersed or reduced to levels where technological sophistication could not be maintained. The hypothesis is unprovable with current evidence, but it offers a framework for thinking about cultural discontinuity. Why does complex society seem to emerge suddenly in multiple regions around 10,000 years ago, shortly after the Younger Dryas ended? Why do flood myths persist across unconnected cultures? Why do some megalithic sites appear to predate the agricultural communities that supposedly built them? One answer: survivors. People who lived through catastrophic climate disruption, who remembered, however dimly, what had been lost, and who encoded those memories into oral traditions that would eventually become the flood. Narratives, the stories of golden ages, destroyed the myths of gods who once walked the earth and taught humanity the arts of civilization. Egypt's own mythology contains echoes. The Zep Tepi, the first time when gods ruled directly and established the order that later pharaohs merely maintained. Was this pure mythology, theological justification for kingship? Or was it distorted memory, the echo of a time before the Younger Dryas, when conditions allowed achievements later generations could only wonder at? We will likely never know. The Younger Dryas was 12 millennia ago. Any physical remains from earlier would be deeply buried, eroded beyond recognition, or drowned beneath seas that rose more than 100 meters as the ice finally, conclusively melted. What survives are stones, ambiguously ancient, precise beyond expectation, aligned to stars that may have marked the sky of a world we can reconstruct only through inference. As the Younger Dryas ended and warmth returned, the Holocene began. Our epoch, the stable 10,000-year window in which agriculture, cities, and writing emerged. But the ending of that cold snap was not smooth. Ice dams collapsed, releasing floods that carved landscapes. Sea levels rose in pulses as ice sheets disintegrated. Coastlines transformed. River valleys drowned. The survivors of these transformations became the ancestors of historical civilizations. What they remembered and what they forgot shapes every monument that puzzles us today. Picture a Sahara that isn't, where today's landscape presents monotonous sand and stone. Imagine instead a mosaic of seasonal wetlands, acacia savannas, and interconnected river systems feeding into shallow lakes that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. Picture elephants moving between water sources, giraffes browsing on trees that haven't grown in the Sahara for 6,000 years, crocodiles basking on riverbanks now buried beneath dunes. Picture humans, hunters, fishers, herders, settling beside these waters, carving petroglyphs into rocks that recorded their prey, their livestock, their boats. This was the African humid period Sahara, a landscape transformed by monsoon systems that penetrated far north of their modern range, bringing summer rains that sustained ecosystems unimaginable to anyone familiar with the Sahara today. The transformation began around 11,000 years ago, shortly after the Younger Dryas ended, and persisted for roughly 6 millennia before aridity returned. Evidence for the Green Sahara comes from multiple sources. Lake sediment cores reveal chemical and biological signatures of deep, permanent water bodies that existed where now there are only salt flats or sand sheets. Fossil pollen shows grassland and woodland vegetation that required substantial rainfall. Archaeological sites contain fish bones, harpoons, and pottery decorated with wavy line patterns, suggesting fisher communities living beside lakes that have since vanished. The rock art is particularly haunting. Thousands of petroglyphs and paintings scattered across the Sahara depict not just the animals that lived during the human period, but also the humans who coexisted with them. Hunters with bows, herders with cattle, boats with passengers. The Tassili Niger Plateau in Algeria contains some of the most extensive and sophisticated rock art in Africa, with images dating from the humid period, showing a populated, verdant landscape where today rainfall is nearly absent. For the cultures living during this green phase, the Sahara was not a barrier, but a corridor, a crossroads where populations moved, traded, and exchanged ideas across regions that later epochs would find impassable. The Nile Valley was not isolated, but connected to broader North African populations who moved seasonally across landscapes now too hostile for habitation. This connectivity matters when considering how knowledge and technologies spread. If the Sahara was green, then cultural exchange between the Nile and regions as far west as the Atlantic or as far south as the Sahel was feasible. Ideas about astronomy, architecture, social organization, all could have moved across networks that vanished when the rains failed. But the rains did fail. Around 5,000 years ago, the African monsoon system weakened again. The transition wasn't instantaneous. There were centuries of fluctuation, with wet periods alternating with dry, but the trend was inexorable. Lakes shrank, rivers dried, vegetation retreated. Human populations faced choices: adapt to increasing aridity through nomadic pastoralism, migrate toward remaining water sources like the Nile Valley, or perish. The archaeological record shows mass migration toward the Nile, beginning around 5,500 years ago, with the valley's population swelling just as the Sahara was desiccating. This influx coincided with the emergence of increasingly complex societies in Egypt: more centralized control, larger settlements, more sophisticated irrigation and agriculture. The pressure of climate refugees may have accelerated social stratification and political consolidation, providing the population base and organizational necessity that led, within centuries, to the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. But what of the knowledge those migrants brought? Communities that had thrived during the humid period would have accumulated millennia of observations: sky watching, stone working, understanding of seasonal patterns and celestial cycles. If some among them had built monuments during the green centuries, stone circles, carved rocks, proto-temples, that knowledge would not vanish immediately. It would be carried in memory, in oral tradition, potentially in the form of inherited sites that new arrivals found already ancient. This is one scenario for how Giza might contain layers of occupation older than the Fourth Dynasty, not built from scratch by Khufu, but adapted from monuments raised during the Sahara screen phase when the climate permitted surplus and settlement on the plateau itself. The weathering on the Sphinx, requiring sustained rainfall, would date to this period. Monuments carved when water still fell on Giza, left to weather for millennia before dynasties arrived to claim and modify them. It's a framework that accommodates both orthodox and alternative evidence. The Fourth Dynasty work is real, documented, carbon-dated, archaeologically contextualized. But beneath it might lie earlier layers, built during the brief window when North Africa bloomed, eroded during the long millennia of desiccation, and eventually discovered by pharaohs who recognized their antiquity and incorporated them into their own monumental programs. The Green Sahara ended 5,000 years ago. Its lakes evaporated, its rivers silted up, its populations dispersed. Within centuries, the memory of that different world would fade, preserved only in rock art no one could read and stones that predated writing. But the stones themselves endured, patient as always, waiting for ages that could ask the right questions. In southeastern Turkey, on a hilltop called Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill in Turkish, archaeologists have excavated what may be the world's oldest monumental architecture. The site consists of circular enclosures defined by massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with elaborate reliefs of animals: foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, wild boars. The pillars stand arranged in rings, with two larger pillars at the center of each enclosure, suggesting deliberate geometric planning and symbolic significance. The construction required quarrying, transporting, and erecting megaliths using only stone tools, no metal, no domesticated animals for hauling, no wheels. The radiocarbon dates are what make Göbekli Tepe revolutionary. The oldest layers date to approximately 9,600 BCE, placing construction at the very beginning of the Holocene epoch. This is pre-pottery Neolithic A, before agriculture, before permanent villages, before pottery or weaving. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were, by conventional definitions, still hunter-gatherers. Yet somehow these supposedly simple foragers organized labor forces to quarry pillars, carved sophisticated symbolic imagery, and constructed enclosures that required planning, geometry, and multi-generational commitment. The site challenges every assumption about the relationship between social complexity and subsistence strategy. You don't need agriculture to build monuments. You don't need cities to create symbolic architecture. You need only motivation, organization, and accumulated knowledge, all of which hunter-gatherers possessed. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Across the Fertile Crescent, archaeologists have identified similar pre-pottery Neolithic sites featuring megalithic construction. Karahan Tepe, Nevali Kori, Kayaun. These sites suggest a broader cultural phenomenon, a fluorescence of monumentality in the early Holocene, driven by populations adapting to post-glacial environments, and perhaps commemorating or attempting to influence the climatic transitions they witnessed. The implications for Egypt are profound. If Anatolian hunter-gatherers could build Göbekli Tepe 11,600 years ago, why not Egyptian or North African populations as well? The technological requirements are similar: stone tools, knowledge of leverage and quarrying, social organization sufficient to coordinate labor. The environmental context is comparable: early Holocene warming, expanding resource bases, increasing population densities as climate stabilized. The difference is preservation. Anatolia's climate is cooler and more stable than Egypt's, with lower erosion rates. Sites abandoned in Anatolia might remain buried but intact for millennia. In Egypt, with its cycles of extreme aridity and occasional flooding, with sandstorms that can bury or expose sites in decades, preservation is more contingent. An Egyptian equivalent of Göbekli Tepe could exist and remain undiscovered, buried beneath later constructions or eroded beyond easy recognition. Moreover, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried. Around 8000 BCE, the builders filled in the enclosures with debris, covering the pillars and essentially closing the site. Whether this was ritual abandonment, a response to climate change, or something else remains unclear. But it meant the site was preserved beneath intentional fill rather than exposed to erosion, a circumstance unlikely to apply to all early Holocene monuments. The existence of Göbekli Tepe forces reconsideration of what civilization means. If complex symbolic thought, monumental architecture, and organized labor precede agriculture and cities, then the pyramid building capacity of Old Kingdom Egypt is not unprecedented. It's the continuation of capabilities humans possessed for millennia, finally channeled through state organization and religious ideology into the specific forms we recognize as Egyptian civilization. But it also opens the possibility that earlier, pre-literate cultures built monuments in Egypt that have been attributed to later dynasties simply because no written records or clear archaeological context survives to establish their true age. The Sphinx's weathering, the Great Pyramid's precision, the astronomical alignments, all could be products of early Holocene builders whose organizational capacity we've systematically underestimated. Göbekli Tepe stands as proof that complexity emerges earlier than we expected, in contexts we didn't predict, built by people we assumed lacked the means. Its pillars, carved with animal forms that blend the real and symbolic, rise from the Turkish landscape as questions addressed to every assumption about human history. And if such monuments could be raised on Anatolian hills, why not on Egyptian plateaus as well, under stars that look down on a world still shaking off the ice? In a cave in southern Germany, archaeologists discovered a piece of worked bone about 30 centimeters long, with carefully drilled holes positioned along its length. The object, carved from the wing bone of a griffin vulture, is a flute, a musical instrument capable of producing melodic tones when air is blown across its openings. The radiocarbon dates associated with the find place the flute's creation at approximately 40,000 years ago, deep in the Upper Paleolithic, when Neanderthals still shared Europe with anatomically modern humans. This makes it one of the oldest known musical instruments in the world, predating agriculture by 30 millennia, predating pottery by 25 millennia, predating the pyramids by 36 millennia. Someone in Ice Age Europe perhaps Homo sapiens, perhaps Neanderthal, selected a vulture bone for its acoustic properties, measured where holes should be placed to produce specific pitches, drilled those holes with stone tools, and created an object whose purpose was not utilitarian survival, but art, music, beauty. The flute speaks to something fundamental about human consciousness, the drive to create meaning beyond mere survival, to transform natural materials into objects of symbolic or aesthetic significance, to impose order, harmonic order, onto sound. This impulse is not recent. It's not a product of civilization or agriculture or cities. It's ancient as language, perhaps older, woven into the cognitive architecture of humanity itself. If Ice Age people made flutes, they sang, they danced, they told stories around fires, passing knowledge and myth from generation to generation in forms that left no written record, but that shaped every subsequent culture. They watched the stars and recognized patterns, tracked seasons and animal migrations with precision that ensured survival. They experimented with materials, learning which stones made the best tools, which plants healed or poisoned, which ochres produced the most vivid pigments for their cave paintings. All this knowledge, accumulated across tens of thousands of years, transmitted orally, preserved in practice and memory, existed long before the first cities rose. It was the foundation upon which everything we call civilization was built, and almost none of it survives in forms archaeology can easily read. The flute survived because bone, in the right conditions, can last. But what of wooden flutes, which would be easier to make and probably more common? What of drums, rattles, string instruments? What of the songs themselves, the rhythms, the harmonic systems that structured Paleolithic music? All gone, lost to time, decay, and the bias of preservation that favors stone over organic material. Monuments over everyday life, the extraordinary over the routine. This is the challenge of reconstructing deep history. The vast majority of human experience leaves no trace. What survives is accidental, contingent on geological and climatic circumstances that favor preservation. We build our narratives from these fragments, knowing that for every artifact we find, thousands or millions had decayed into oblivion. The vulture flute reminds us that sophistication is ancient, that the people who lived through the Ice Age were not dim proto-humans waiting for civilization to rescue them from brutishness. They were us, creative, curious, capable of abstraction and beauty, building cultures as rich in meaning as any that followed, cultures we can barely glimpse through the narrow lens of surviving artifacts. If 40,000-year-old flutes exist, what else might we have lost? What knowledge, techniques, observations, and achievements vanished because they were encoded in media that didn't survive? What would we understand differently about the pyramids, about Giza, about Egypt's origins, if we could recover even a fraction of the cultural knowledge that preceded writing and stone monuments? The flute plays no more, but its silence is more eloquent than sound, speaking across 40 millennia to remind us that human hands have always reached for more than survival, always sought to make beauty, meaning, and music from the bones of the world. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, a story repeats: the world drowned. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim, who survives a divine flood by building an ark and preserving living creatures. The biblical Noah recapitulates this narrative with slight variations. In Hindu texts, Manu survives a deluge with help from a fish avatar of Vishnu. Greek mythology preserves Deucalion's flood, sent by Zeus to cleanse humanity's corruption. Indigenous Australian, Polynesian, and Native American traditions contain similar narratives. Catastrophic waters rising, near total destruction, and a small remnant surviving to rebuild. Are these independent inventions natural expressions of humanity's sphere of water and chaos, or are they memories, however distorted, of actual events? The end of the last ice age provides a plausible historical kernel. Between 19,000 and 7,000 years ago, global sea levels rose approximately 120 meters as continental ice sheets melted. This wasn't a smooth process. Ice dams holding back glacial lakes would periodically collapse, releasing catastrophic floods that carved landscapes and raised sea levels in sudden pulses. The Black Sea may have been a freshwater lake until around 5600 BCE, when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus, flooding the basin in what some geologists argue was a rapid, catastrophic inundation. For coastal populations living through these events, the experience would have been apocalyptic. Settlements occupied for generations suddenly underwater, coastlines retreating kilometers inland within human lifetimes, river valleys drowned, turning familiar landscapes into alien seascapes. The survivors would carry these memories, encoding them into oral traditions that eventually became flood myths. Egypt's own mythology contains aqueous themes: the primordial ocean Nun, from which creation emerged, the annual Nile flood that brought both destruction and fertility, the goddesses and gods associated with water's life-giving and life-taking powers. The country as very existence depended on flood, the inundation that deposited fertile silt, but which could also destroy when it rose too high. Could Egyptian flood traditions also preserve memories of older events? Of coastlines transformed when the Mediterranean rose? Of Nile discharge patterns altered dramatically as Ice Age conditions shifted? The Nile's course during the Pleistocene was significantly different from its current path, with multiple channels and lakes that have since vanished. Populations living along the late Pleistocene Nile would have witnessed dramatic hydrological changes as climate shifted. Some researchers propose that the pyramids themselves are monuments to flood memory, artificial mountains intended to rise above waters real or mythological, ensuring that at least some part of civilization endured whatever deluge might come. The shape itself, stable, massive, tapering to resist collapse, could be interpreted as architecturally encoding resistance to catastrophic forces. This reading is speculative, but it aligns with broader patterns in Egyptian cosmology: obsession with permanence, with defeating time and chaos, represented as water and formlessness, with creating order that could withstand any challenge. If the cultural memory embedded in Egyptian religion included catastrophic floods from the end of the Ice Age, then building monuments designed to survive those floods, however symbolically, would be logical. The precision of the pyramids' construction, their astronomical alignments, their incorporation of mathematical relationships, all these features could be understood as encoding knowledge meant to survive catastrophe. If a civilization expected periodic destruction, whether from flood, climate shift, or other disasters, it might attempt to preserve essential knowledge in stone using geometry and alignment as a language that could be decoded by survivors or successors. This is, of course, conjecture layered on speculation, but it's grounded in recognition that oral traditions preserve surprising amounts of historical information, however transformed by mythological elaboration. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions describe coastlines and landmarks now submerged, providing information that aligns with sea level rise timelines archaeologists have established independently. If Australian traditions can preserve 10,000-year-old geographical memories, why not Egyptian traditions as well? The flood myths persist because they touch something fundamental: the precariousness of human existence against geological and climatic forces we cannot control. Every coastline is temporary. Every river changes course. Every climate is transitional. The stable Holocene epoch in which civilization emerged is an anomaly, a 10,000-year window of relative calm bracketed by catastrophic shifts. The pyramids, rising on the Giza plateau above the Nile's floodplain, may be many things: tombs, temples, astronomical markers, monuments to ego. But they may also be defiance, stone-carved refusal to let water, time, and forgetting erase what humans learned, built, and became. The floods have receded. the seas have stabilized, but the memory remains, encoded in myths that span the world and in stones that stand against the sky, silent testimony to the determination that some part of us must survive. Before GPS, before compasses, before written maps, humans navigated by the stars. The night sky was humanity's first universal text, readable across cultures and millennia. Stellar positions marked cardinal directions. Circumpolar stars indicated true north. The seasonal appearance and disappearance of constellations tracked the year's progress, telling observers when to plant, when to harvest, when to move camps or prepare for floods. The sky was clock, calendar, and map combined, and it was everywhere, available to any who learned to read its patterns. Ancient builders understood this. Across the world, megalithic structures demonstrate astronomical alignments. Stonehenge's axis points to the summer solstice sunrise. Newgrange's passage admits light only on the winter solstice. The Mayan pyramids incorporate observations of Venus and the solar year. These weren't coincidences. They were intentional incorporations of celestial knowledge into architectural form, making monuments that functioned as observatories, calendars, and symbolic links between earth and sky. The Great Pyramid participates fully in this tradition. Its sides align to the cardinal directions with an accuracy of better than 0.1 degrees, precision that requires careful astronomical observation. The pyramid's location at 30 degrees north latitude is geometrically significant, and some researchers argue this placement encodes relationships between polar and equatorial measurements, embedding geodetic knowledge into the structure's position. But it's the interior features that most strongly suggest astronomical purpose. The pyramid contains 4 narrow shafts extending from the King S and Queen S chambers toward the outer surface. Unlike the main passages, these shafts are too small for human access, roughly 20 centimeters square. For decades, Egyptologists assumed they were ventilation shafts, though their small size and irregular construction make them poorly suited for that purpose. In the 1960s, astronomer Alexander Badoy and engineer Virginia Trimble proposed an alternative. The shafts were aligned to specific stars. Using computer models to reconstruct the night sky as it appeared over Giza, circa 2500 BCE, they demonstrated that the northern shaft from the king's chamber pointed toward Thuban Alpha Draconis, the pole star of that era. The southern shaft aimed at Al-Nidaq Zeta Orionis, the lowest star in Orion's belt, a constellation Egyptians associated with Osiris, god of the afterlife. The shafts from the queen's chamber showed similar alignments. The northern shaft targeted Kakub, Beta Persei Minoris in the Little Dipper, while the southern shaft pointed toward Sirius, the brightest star in the sky and deeply significant in Egyptian cosmology as the celestial form of Isis. These alignments suggest the pyramid was designed not merely as a tomb, but as a machine for celestial ascension, a device to enable the pharaoh's soul to travel to specific stellar destinations associated with deities and the afterlife. The pyramid texts inscribed in later 5th and 6th dynasty pyramids are full of star journey imagery, the king ascending to the imperishable stars, joining the circumpolar constellations that never set, or traveling to Orion's realm in the southern sky. The Great Pyramid contains no pyramid texts, but its architecture may encode the same theology in 3-dimensional form. The shafts become pathways for the soul, aimed with precision at the very stars the texts describe. Stone and sky unite, creating a monument that is simultaneously earthbound and celestial. Yet astronomical alignments raise as many questions as they answer. The precision required to orient the pyramid and aim its shafts suggests sophisticated observational astronomy, not just casual sky watching, but systematic measurements, probably conducted over years to account for atmospheric refraction and precessional changes. This implies a class of priest astronomers with knowledge accumulated across generations, carefully measuring and recording stellar positions and movements. Did this knowledge originate in the Old Kingdom, or was it inherited from earlier traditions? Were the Fourth Dynasty builders working from established astronomical lore that predated dynastic Egypt? The precision suggests long tradition, not sudden innovation. Observation refined over centuries or millennia until celestial mechanics were understood well enough to be encoded into architecture. The stars themselves have shifted since the pyramids were built. This is the foundation of the Orion correlation theory and related astronomical dating proposals. The idea that pyramid alignments encode not the sky of 2500 BC, but the sky of an earlier epoch, possibly 10500 BCE, near the end of the last ice age. If true, it would suggest either that the pyramids are far older than currently believed, or that their builders possessed astronomical records, extending back thousands of years before the monuments were constructed. Records of previous sky configurations, preserved in oral or symbolic form. The stars keep their secrets. They wheel overhead, indifferent to human chronology, marking time in cycles that dwarf civilizations. And the stones that point toward them stand silent, encoding knowledge in geometry and alignment, a language we can read in fragments, but perhaps not fully comprehend. In 1989, Robert Bauval proposed a correlation that would ignite decades of controversy. Standing on the Giza plateau and looking at the three main pyramids, Khufu's Great Pyramid, Khafer's slightly smaller monument, and Menkaur's distinctly smaller third pyramid, Bauval noticed something peculiar about their arrangement. The first two pyramids align almost perfectly along a diagonal, but the third sits slightly offset to the east of that line. The pattern seemed deliberate, not an error in planning, but an intentional reproduction of something else. Looking up at the night sky, Bauval saw what that something might be: Orion's belt, the three bright stars that form the hunter's waist in the constellation Orion. Two stars, Alnitak and Alnilam, align closely, while the third, Mintaka, sits offset to the east by roughly the same proportion as Menkaur's pyramid. The correspondence wasn't perfect, but it was suggestive enough to propose a hypothesis. The Giza pyramids were laid out as a terrestrial map of Orion's belt. The theory gained elaboration. The Nile's course past Giza could represent the Milky Way, which runs past Orion in the celestial sphere. Other pyramid sites along the Nile might correspond to other stars, creating an entire Egyptian landscape designed as a mirror of the heavens. The concept resonated with Egyptian religious texts that explicitly linked the pharaoh's afterlife with Orion, identified as the celestial form of Osiris. As above, so below, the Hermetic principle that would emerge millennia later in Western esoteric tradition seemed encoded in Egypt's monumental geography. But Bauval went further. Using computer simulations to reconstruct the sky at different epochs, he noted that Orion's position relative to the horizon changes due to precession. Around 10,500 BCE, Orion's belt reached its lowest point in its precessional cycle, sitting at a particular declination that Bauval argued corresponded more precisely to the pyramid layout than the configuration visible in 2500 BCE. He proposed that the monuments encoded the sky not of their supposed construction date, but of this much earlier epoch, either because they were built then, or because their Fourth Dynasty builders were commemorating that specific celestial configuration for symbolic reasons. The Orion correlation theory, as it became known, attracted both enthusiasm and fierce criticism. Supporters saw it as evidence of astronomical sophistication and possibly of extreme antiquity. Critics pointed out numerous problems. The correlation between pyramid positions and star positions wasn't as precise as claimed. The Nile's course has changed dramatically over millennia, undermining any correspondence with the Milky Way. Precession affects different stars differently, and cherry-picking one epoch for alignment, while ignoring others, is methodologically questionable. Egyptologists largely rejected the theory on archaeological grounds. The pyramids have clear Fourth Dynasty contexts. workers' graffiti, surrounding tombs, architectural evolution from earlier pyramid attempts. There's no physical evidence supporting construction in 10,500 BCE, and no explanation for why 4th dynasty builders would orient their monuments to commemorate a sky configuration from 8,000 years earlier. Yet the theory persists because it speaks to something genuine. The pyramids do have astronomical significance. Orion was deeply important in Egyptian theology, and the layout of Giza does show intentional geometric relationships beyond random placement. Whether those relationships specifically encode Orion's belt is debatable, but the broader principle that pyramid builders incorporated celestial observations into terrestrial architecture is well established. Perhaps the truth lies in synthesis. The pyramids were built when Egyptology says they were built by the pharaohs whose names are inscribed in and around them. But their astronomical alignments, their geometric relationships, their symbolic resonances draw on knowledge accumulated over far longer periods. The 4th dynasty builders weren't inventing astronomical architecture. They were perfecting and monumentalizing traditions of sky watching that extended back through Neolithic cultures into the deep prehistory of North African populations who tracked stars because survival depended on predicting seasons. In this reading, the 10,500 BCE date isn't when the pyramids were built, but when certain key astronomical observations were made, observations that entered oral tradition, became mythologically significant, and were eventually encoded into stone monuments by dynasties that preserved but no longer fully understood the origin of the knowledge they inherited. The shadow of Orion falls across Giza at certain times of night when the constellation hangs low in the southern sky. For a few hours, if you stand in the right position, you can see the 3 stars hovering above the 3 pyramids, earthly geometry echoing celestial pattern. Whether that echo is coincidence, 4th dynasty intention, or the preservation of far older knowledge remains one of archaeology's most contentious questions. But the pattern is there. The stones and stars align, separated by 93 million miles and perhaps by thousands of years of human observation, yet connected through geometry that either chance or purpose has made meaningful. A constellation wheels overhead, unaware it ever had terrestrial shadow, and the pyramids endure beneath it, stone mountains that will outlast our certainties about when, why, or by whom they were raised. The shafts inside the Great Pyramid angle upward with precise geometric regularity. From the King's Chamber, the southern shaft rises at approximately 45 degrees, while the northern shaft descends at about 32 degrees. These aren't arbitrary angles. They're calculated trajectories, aimed with purpose at specific celestial targets. The southern shaft pointed at Orion's belt, specifically at Al-Nidek, Orion's lowest star, which represented the celestial Osiris in Egyptian cosmology. The northern shaft targeted Alpha Draconis Thuban, which served as the pole star around 2500 BCE. The Queen's Chamber shafts mirror this astronomical intention. The southern shaft aimed toward Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, associated with the goddess Isis and with the annual Nile flood, since Sirius's heliacal rising, its first appearance above the eastern horizon before dawn, coincided with the inundation. The northern shaft targeted Kakab in Ursa Minor, another circumpolar star connected to Egyptian concepts of the imperishable stars that never set and therefore represented eternal life. These alignments weren't incidental. The shafts are too precisely angled, too consistently oriented across multiple chambers to be anything but deliberate astronomical instruments. They transform the pyramid's interior into a star machine, a device for connecting the buried pharaoh with specific celestial destinations. But there's a complication. The shafts don't actually reach the exterior. Modern exploration using robotic cameras revealed that the Queen's Chamber shafts terminate in small doors with copper handles, beyond which the shafts continue for some distance before ending in blank walls. The king's chamber shafts reach closer to the surface, but also stop before emerging. If they were meant for ventilation or for the pharaoh's soul to physically traverse, why don't they connect to the outside? One explanation focuses on symbolic function rather than literal passage. The shafts point towards stellar destinations, encoding theological geography into architecture, but they're not meant as physical channels. They're representational, creating a three-dimensional diagram of the afterlife journey described in religious texts. The pharaoh's soul, being non-corporeal, wouldn't need physical openings, only correct orientation toward its destination. Another interpretation suggests the pyramid underwent design changes during construction. Perhaps the original plan included shafts that reached the exterior, but structural concerns or evolving theological concepts led builders to terminate them internally. The presence of copper handles on the doors blocking the queen's chamber shafts suggests those doors were installed deliberately, not as permanent seals, but as closures that might be opened, though by whom or for purpose remains unclear. The geometric precision of the shafts raises another question. How did 4th dynasty builders achieve such exact angles through tens of meters of solid limestone? Modern engineers struggle to explain the methodology. The shafts had to be carved from both ends, from the chambers outward and from the exterior, or from higher galleries, inward, with the two sections meeting perfectly. This requires sophisticated surveying techniques, accurate measurement tools, and mathematical understanding to maintain consistent angles through stone courses that vary in thickness and hardness. Some researchers propose that the builders used plumb bobs and right-angle tools in combination with astronomical sightings, establishing baseline angles from the chambers and then projecting those angles through the stone mass. Others suggest that the pyramid's internal gallery, the grand gallery that leads to the king's chamber, might have served as an enormous sighting device. Its steep angle and length allowing precise astronomical observations that were then transferred into the shaft angles. Whatever the method, the result demonstrates command of both observational astronomy and practical engineering. The builders knew which stars to target, understood how to calculate the angles required to point at those stars from specific interior locations, and possessed the technical capability to carve shafts that maintained those angles across dozens of meters. This integration of cosmic knowledge and terrestrial construction appears throughout the pyramid's design. The base perimeter relates to Earth's circumference through specific ratios. The height-to-base ratio approximates pi, possibly coincidentally or possibly through intentional incorporation of circular geometry. The structure's alignment to true north is more accurate than many modern buildings. Even the choice of the Giza plateau itself may encode geographic knowledge. The site sits almost exactly on the 30th parallel north latitude, 1/3 of the way from equator to pole, a location that some argue represents conscious geodetic awareness. Whether these geometric relationships are intentional or the result of pattern-seeking minds finding order in structures whose true purposes are simpler remains debated. But the shafts, at least, are unambiguous in their astronomical purpose. They're not ventilation, not symbolic passages to vague heavenly realms, but specific trajectories aimed at specific stars with precision that require deep understanding of celestial mechanics. The stars those shafts once targeted have shifted due to precession. Thuban is no longer the pole star. Orion's belt rises at different declinations. Sirius's heliacal rising no longer coincides perfectly with the Nile's flood. The sky the pyramid builders knew as wheeled away, replaced by configurations they never witnessed. Yet the shafts remain, locked in stone, still pointing at angles calculated for stars that mattered to a people whose civilization has itself become archaeology. The geometry endures even when its purpose fades, waiting for minds curious enough to trace those trajectories back to their celestial targets and wonder what compelled ancient builders to embed the stars so permanently into stone. Press your hand against the Great Pyramid's limestone blocks and you touch ancient ocean. The stone beneath your palm, quarried from the Giza Plateau, itself during the Old Kingdom, is sedimentary rock formed from the compressed remains of marine organisms that lived approximately 50 million years ago during the Eocene epoch. The limestone is packed with fossils, nummulites, disc-shaped foraminifera that carpeted Tethys sea floors, their calcium carbonate shells accumulating in layers that lithified over geological time into the bedrock that became Egypt. These fossils are visible to the naked eye in many blocks. Small spirals and circular impressions stipple the stone's surface, organic geometry frozen into mineral permanence. Each fossil represents an individual organism that lived, reproduced, and died when Egypt was not desert plateau, but shallow tropical sea, when North Africa sat farther south on the Earth's surface, when the continents themselves occupied different configurations. The presence of marine fossils in pyramid stones connects the monuments to timescales that dwarf human history. While pharaohs and dynasties play out their dramas across centuries, the stones themselves measure time in epochs, the slow accumulation of sediment on ancient seabeds, the tectonic uplift that raised ocean floor into plateau, the erosion that exposed limestone to quarrying civilizations 50 million years after the organisms that created it perished. Egyptian mythology intuited this connection between stone and water. Creation narratives describe the primordial ocean Nun, from which the first land, the Benben, the primordial mound, emerged. The pyramids, with their sloping sides rising from flat desert, architecturally echo this cosmogony: land rising from water, order emerging from chaos, permanence carved from the substance of ancient seas. Whether this mythological resonance was conscious, whether Egyptian priests understood that the stone they revered as eternal was itself formed from ocean, is unknowable. But the symbolism aligns perfectly. Building immortality monuments from rock that originated in the sea, creating artificial mountains from compressed marine, life-raising structures meant to defeat time using materials that already had defeated time, merely by persisting through 50 million years of geological change. The Nile Valley's relationship with water reinforced this symbolic connection. Egypt existed because of the river's annual flood, which deposited fertile silt that enabled agriculture. The flood was not merely practical necessity, but theological event, manifestation of divine order that had to be ritually maintained through pharaonic performance of correct religious observances. Water brought life, but it also represented the chaos that preceded creation, the formless ocean from which gods made ordered existence. Pyramids, in this context, become assertions of permanence against dissolution. They're built from stone that remembers being sea, yet they stand as mountains that will never return to water. They incorporate the primordial chaos, the ancient ocean compressed into limestone, and transform it into geometric order. Right angles, precise orientation, calculated mass distribution that resists entropy. This theological reading finds unexpected support in geology. The Giza Plateau is indeed former seabed, uplifted and dried through the same tectonic processes that continue reshaping Earth's surface. The limestone that builders quarried had been underwater far longer than it's been dry land. On deep time scales, the plateau's current state as terrestrial desert is the anomaly, a brief interval between marine submergences. Yet for the past 50 million years, that brief interval has persisted, creating conditions that allowed first life's colonization of land, then the evolution of mammals, primates, hominins, and eventually humans capable of quarrying the ancient seabed to build monuments. The same geological stability that raised the plateau made civilization possible and provided the raw material from which that civilization constructed its most enduring symbols. Every stone in the Great Pyramid is a tomb for countless organisms, microscopic foraminifera, whose shells have outlasted the seas that created them. The pyramid is built from death, from the compressed remains of vanished marine ecosystems, from calcium carbonate extracted by ancient life forms that unknowingly provided the substance future builders would use to construct their own immortality projects. There's poetry in this, life-building monuments from earlier life, using the petrified remnants of 50-million-year-old seas to assert permanence, creating artificial mountains from what was once ocean floor. The Nummulites that died when Egypt was underwater could not have conceived that their shells would eventually form blocks in structures raised to defeat death itself. But on geological timescales, both the Nummulites and the pyramids are temporary. Seas rise and fall. Continents drift. Climate shifts. What is desert becomes ocean. What is ocean becomes mountain. The fossils in the pyramid stones are not the oldest deaths those molecules have witnessed, nor will the pyramid's eventual erosion be the last transformation they undergo. The sea is in the stone. It always was. And long after the pyramids have eroded to unrecognizable rubble, the calcium carbonate molecules that once formed Nummulite shells, then limestone blocks, then the Great Pyramid itself, will continue their journey through Earth's slow cycles, perhaps returning, eventually, to the ocean from which they came. Beneath the Mediterranean, cities sleep in silt and darkness. In 2000, marine archaeologist Frank Gaudio's team discovered the submerged ruins of Heracleion, called Thonis by the Egyptians, in Abu Qir Bay near Alexandria. The city had been Egypt's main port during the late period, a bustling commercial center where Greek traders met Egyptian merchants, where customs duties were collected, where religious festivals drew pilgrims from across the Mediterranean world. Ancient texts mentioned it, describing its temples, harbors, and commercial significance. Then, sometime in the 8th century CE, Heracleion vanished, not destroyed by conquest or fire, but drowned, subsiding into the sea as the Nile Delta's geology shifted. The city sank gradually enough that inhabitants could evacuate, but thoroughly enough that it disappeared from history, its location forgotten for 12 centuries. Gaudio's underwater excavations revealed a metropolis frozen in time, colossal statues of gods and pharaohs lying toppled on the seabed, the foundations of a massive temple to Amun-Gareb granite columns still standing where they'd been erected 2,000 years ago. Gold jewelry, bronze artifacts lead anchors for merchant ships. The harbor's topography was still readable underwater, channels, quays, warehouse districts, all preserved beneath sediment and sea. Nearby, the same team discovered Canopus, another submerged delta city known from ancient sources. Together, these sites revealed how much of Egypt's coastal history lies literally underwater, drowned by the combination of sea level changes, tectonic subsidence, and the delta's geological instability. The Nile Delta is built on sediment, river deposits accumulating over millennia, which makes it prone to compaction, subsidence, and erosion. Coastlines shift, channels migrate. Cities built on what seemed solid ground sink as the sediment beneath them settles and sea levels rise. But if cities from the late period, a mere 2,500 years ago, can vanish beneath the waves, what of older settlements? What of pre-dynastic or even pre-Neolithic communities that might have occupied the delta when it had a different configuration, when the Mediterranean coastline sat farther north, when the Nile's distributaries followed different paths? During the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago, the Mediterranean's coastline was kilometers seaward of its current position. The Nile flowed through a valley, not a delta, cutting through a merged continental shelf before reaching the sea. Communities living along that Paleo-Nile would have occupied lands that are now underwater. When the ice melted and sea levels rose, those settlements were drowned, along with any cultural achievements they might have represented. Archaeological surveying of Egypt's submerged continental shelf has been minimal. The cost and technical difficulty of underwater archaeology limit the extent of exploration. But what surveys exist suggest there are Neolithic sites beneath the Mediterranean, remnants of communities that thrived during the African humid period when the Nile's discharge and the sea's level created different coastal ecologies. This raises tantalizing questions about cultural continuity and knowledge preservation. If pre-dynastic populations occupied the now-drowned delta coastline, what knowledge did they accumulate? What architectural traditions, astronomical observations, artistic developments, social organizations? If those coastal populations eventually migrated inland as seas rose, they would have brought their cultural knowledge into the Nile Valley. Knowledge that might have seeded the developments that eventually became pharaonic civilization. The drowning of coastal settlements is not just an Egyptian phenomenon. Across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, submerged ruins hint at cultures disrupted by post-glacial sea level rise. In the Black Sea specifically, geological evidence suggests catastrophic flooding around 5600 BCE when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosporus Strait, converting what had been a lower, perhaps freshwater lake into the current saltwater sea. Coastal settlements around the pre-flood Black Sea would have been inundated rapidly, their populations dispersed, their achievements erased from terrestrial archaeology, and preserved, if at all, only in submerged contexts or in the flood myths their survivors carried into new territories. Could similar catastrophic flooding have affected Egypt's delta? Probably not to the same dramatic extent as the Black Sea event, but the broader pattern holds. Coastlines changed dramatically during the Holocene, and communities adapted or perished. Some of what we consider sudden cultural innovations, the apparent rapid emergence of complex society in Egypt around 3100 BCE, may actually represent coalescence of multiple pre-existing traditions, some of which originated in now submerged coastal regions. The sea guards these secrets jealously. Marine archaeology is expensive, technologically demanding, and limited in scope. Sediment cover sites. Currents scatter artifacts. Organic materials decay even faster in salt water than on land. What remains, stone, metal, ceramics, gives only fragmentary evidence of cultures that are mostly lost. Yet the drowned cities remind us that the geography we know is recent, that coastlines are temporary, that societies can thrive for centuries and then vanish so completely that their very existence is forgotten, until divers stumble upon their ruins lying in darkness beneath the waves. How many other cities sleep beneath the Mediterranean? How many pre-dynastic settlements, Neolithic villages, or even older encampments now lie beyond archaeological reach, drowned by the seas that rose when the ice melted? And what knowledge did they possess about stars, stones, seasons, and survival that was lost when the waters swallowed the lands they occupied? The pyramids stand on plateau, far enough from the sea to have escaped submergence. But the cultures that built them may have roots in coastal traditions now inaccessible, preserved only in the cultural DNA of their successors, and in stones that encode knowledge whose origins are as drowned as Heraclean. The Mediterranean keeps rising, millimeter by millimeter, year by year, and the cities beneath its waters become increasingly difficult to read as time and tide continue their slow work of erasure. Writing is young, consciousness is ancient. The earliest Egyptian hieroglyphs appear around 3200 BCE, scratched onto pottery and carved into ceremonial palettes. They're not primitive, they're sophisticated, combining phonetic symbols with logograms and determinatives in a system that suggests long developmental history. Yet that development is invisible. We possess no intermediate stages, no proto-writing experiments, showing how visual symbols gradually acquired phonetic values. The hieroglyphic system appears suddenly, almost fully formed, as if imported whole or emerging from a pre-literate tradition we cannot access. This is the paradox of historical reconstruction. We privilege written sources because they preserve explicit information across millennia, but writing itself is extremely recent in human timescales. Anatomically modern humans emerged approximately 300,000 years ago. Behaviorally modern humans, with symbolic thought, complex language, art, and ritual, appeared at least 100,000 years ago. For the vast majority of human existence, knowledge was transmitted orally, encoded in story, ritual, art, and practice. Those oral traditions were not inferior. In many ways, they were superior, more flexible, more responsive to context, more deeply embedded in social relationships, and embodied practice. Skilled oral poets could memorize epics extending tens of thousands of lines. Aboriginal Australian songlines preserved geographical, ecological, and historical knowledge across hundreds of generations. Polynesian navigators transmitted oceanic navigation techniques through apprenticeship systems that enabled colonization of Pacific islands, separated by thousands of kilometers of open water. But oral traditions are vulnerable. They require continuous transmission, living chains of teachers and students. When those chains break through war, disease, climate catastrophe, or cultural disruption, the knowledge vanishes. No archaeological excavation can recover an oral epic. No linguistic analysis can reconstruct a myth that stopped being told before any language documentation occurred. This vulnerability means we can be certain countless sophisticated cultures existed, accumulated profound knowledge, developed complex traditions, and then vanished without trace into the oblivion that awaits all oral-only societies. The question is not whether such cultures existed, but how sophisticated they might have been, and whether any of their achievements left indirect evidence. Could pre-literate cultures have built monumentally? Göbekli Tepe proves they could. Could they have developed sophisticated astronomical observations? Again, evidence says yes. Alignments in megalithic structures worldwide demonstrate systematic sky watching that predates writing by millennia. Could they have developed geometric understanding, principles of leverage and engineering, organizational sophistication to coordinate large labor forces? The monuments themselves answer affirmatively. What they could not do is leave explicit records explaining their motivations, describing their methods, or preserving their cultural contexts in ways that survive beyond living memory. When an oral tradition dies, it leaves only mute artifacts whose meanings must be inferred, debated, and often misunderstood by later cultures working from entirely different assumptions. This creates space for alternative histories of Giza. If the monuments encode knowledge from pre-literate cultures, not necessarily building the structures whole, but establishing sacred sites, creating initial monuments, making astronomical observations that were later incorporated into dynastic architecture, we would not expect written records. The knowledge would transmit orally until writing emerged, at which point it might be recorded in forms we recognize as myth, stories of gods, first times, epics before human memory. Egyptian texts preserve hints of such traditions. The Zep Tepi, the first time, is described as an epoch when gods ruled directly, when order was established, when knowledge was given to humanity. Egyptologists interpret this as pure theology, legitimating narratives with no historical content. But what if it's distorted memory? What if the gods were ancestors whose achievements seemed godlike to descendants who had lost the knowledge that made those achievements possible? The Edfu temple texts inscribed during the Ptolemaic period, but claiming to record ancient traditions, describe a company of sages, the Shebju, who survived a catastrophe and preserved knowledge by writing it on temple walls. The texts describe these sages as coming from an island that was destroyed, their knowledge nearly lost. This narrative appears late in Egyptian history, written in a period when Egypt was actively interested in recovering and romanticizing its archaic past, so its historical reliability is questionable. Yet the motif persists, knowledge under threat, preserved by survivors, encoded in forms that might outlast catastrophe. It's a narrative pattern that appears across cultures, suggesting either a universal psychological archetype or a shared historical experience. Survivors of climate disruptions, cultural collapses, or technological regressions attempting to pass forward whatever they could salvage. The Great Pyramid contains no inscriptions in its main chambers. Later pyramids are covered in pyramid texts, but Khufu's monument is silent. This absence has been interpreted various ways. Perhaps inscriptions were planned but never executed. Perhaps they existed but were removed. Perhaps the absence was itself intentional, creating a monument that would outlast language, whose meaning would be carried in proportion, alignment, and geometry, rather than in words that might become incomprehensible. If you wanted to preserve knowledge across timescales that might see languages die and writing systems forgotten, encoding it in stone architecture has advantages over text. Geometry is universal. Astronomical alignments can be measured by any culture with sky-watching capability. Mathematical relationships embedded in proportion can be discovered through measurement, regardless of cultural context. The Great Pyramid, in this reading, becomes a time capsule designed not for its own era, but for epochs distant enough that the language and culture that built it might be extinct. This is, of course, speculative, but it's grounded in recognition that the vast majority of human history is unwritten, that sophisticated knowledge and complex societies existed long before writing, and that oral traditions, however rich and nuanced, leave no archaeological trace once the last speaker dies. The pyramids may speak a language older than hieroglyphs, more durable than papyrus, preserved in ratios and alignments that wait patiently for minds curious and patient enough to learn their grammar. When Napoleon Bonaparte's forces occupied Egypt in 1798, the French brought with them not just military ambition, but also Enlightenment curiosity. Among the expedition's members were scientists, engineers, artists, and scholars whose work would produce the monumental description d'Egypte, a comprehensive documentation of Egyptian antiquities, natural history, and contemporary culture. The expedition marked the beginning of Egyptology as a systematic discipline, transforming European understanding of the ancient civilization and ultimately leading to the decipherment of hieroglyphs. But Napoleon's scholars encountered something unexpected: local traditions that contradicted emerging European chronologies of Egyptian history. Egyptians living near the pyramids, farmers, guides, village elders, told stories about the monuments that placed their construction far earlier than any pharaonic dynasty. Some traditions claimed the pyramids predated the biblical flood, built by giants or by antediluvian kings whose names and deeds had been forgotten but whose works remained. These folk traditions weren't taken seriously by European scholars, who dismissed them as ignorant superstition, degraded echoes of genuine history contaminated by imagination and the passage of centuries. Yet the persistence of such traditions is itself noteworthy. Why would local populations, living in proximity to the monuments for generations, develop and maintain stories about their extreme antiquity if the pyramids were relatively recent pharaonic constructions whose dates and builders were documented in hieroglyphic inscriptions? One possibility: the traditions preserved information that hieroglyphic texts did not. Oral history often retains memories that official records ignore or suppress. Egypt's written chronicles focused on kings, dynasties, conquests, and temples, not on pre-dynastic populations, climate shifts, or the appropriation of earlier monuments. If Fourth Dynasty pharaohs had indeed inherited and modified structures built earlier, official records would credit the pharaohs, while oral traditions might remember the earlier layers. Another possibility: the traditions reflect cultural beliefs about sacred antiquity. Making monuments older than recorded history increases their religious authority, links them to cosmogonic time rather than mundane chronology. In this reading, the extreme age claimed by folk traditions is theological rather than historical. Statements about the pyramids, sacred status rather than literal chronology. Yet a third possibility: the traditions are simply wrong. The natural tendency of myth to aggrandize and exaggerate, to place beloved monuments outside human time and attribute them to gods, heroes, or vanished races. This is the conventional academic position, Local legends are culturally interesting, but historically unreliable, reflecting imagination rather than memory. What's striking, though, is how many independent traditions, Egyptian folk narratives, Greek histories based on Egyptian priest accounts, Arabic medieval texts, assign the pyramids ages far greater than Orthodox Egyptology accepts. Herodotus, visiting Egypt in the 5th century BCE and interviewing priests, recorded traditions about the monuments that even then were inconsistent and contradictory, suggesting that knowledge about their true origins was already fragmentary or contested. The medieval Arabic historian al-Makrizi, writing in the 15th century CE, documented Egyptian traditions claiming the pyramids were built before the flood as repositories of knowledge meant to survive catastrophe. These accounts described the monuments as containing astronomical instruments, chemical knowledge, and weapons, clearly elaborated and fantastical, but perhaps containing kernels of genuine tradition about the pyramid's astronomical functions and their role as knowledge repositories. Napoleon himself, according to legend, spent a night alone inside the Great Pyramid's king's chamber and emerged shaken, refusing to describe what he'd experienced. The story is probably apocryphal, but it reflects the monument's power to inspire wonder and speculation, even in rational Enlightenment minds. The pyramid was already ancient beyond easy comprehension in Napoleon's time, already enigmatic, already accumulating layers of interpretation that mixed observation, imagination, and whatever genuine historical memories persisted in folk tradition. The legends Napoleon scholars recorded are not evidence of the pyramid's extreme age, but they're evidence that questions about the monument's origins and purposes were not invented by modern alternative researchers. They were present in Egyptian consciousness for centuries, perhaps millennia, suggesting that the pyramid's meanings and histories have never been fully settled, never unambiguous, never reducible to simple chronologies. The scholars dismissed the legends, but the legends persisted, carried forward by populations who lived with the monuments daily, who incorporated them into their cosmologies, and told stories about them across generations. And sometimes, folk memory preserves truths that official histories forget. The Great Pyramid weighs approximately 6 million tons. That mass represents not just stone, but time, geological time compressed into limestone, human time invested in quarrying and construction, and historical time accumulated as the monument has weathered, been explored, interpreted, and reimagined across millennia of cultural change. Every block carries multiple histories. First, the deep time of its formation, 50 million years of marine sedimentation, lithification, tectonic uplift. Then the human time of its quarrying, workers selecting beds, cutting channels, levering blocks free from bedrock. Then the time of transport and placement, hauling, positioning, fitting each stone into the growing structure. Then centuries of weathering, visitation, wonder, and study. The pyramid is palimpsest written in stone each era, inscribing its own meanings over previous interpretations without ever fully erasing what came before. To the 4th dynasty Egyptians, who completed it, the pyramid was tomb, stellar ascension machine, and pharaonic statement of divine authority. To Middle Kingdom Egyptians, 1,000 years later, it was already ancient, a monument from the golden age of pyramid building that their own era could not match. To the Greeks and Romans, it was wonder and mystery, attributed to kings they knew mostly through legend. To medieval Arabs, it was treasure vault and engineering marvel, subject of speculation and occasional excavation. To Enlightenment Europeans, it became data point in emerging archaeological science, evidence for reconstructing ancient civilizations through material remains rather than textual traditions. To Victorian Romantics, it was embodiment of Oriental mystery and lost wisdom. To 20th century alternative researchers, it became potential evidence for prehistoric high civilizations or extraterrestrial contact. To contemporary Egyptologists, it remains 4th dynasty monument, impressive but explicable within known parameters of Bronze Age engineering. Each interpretation reflects its era's preoccupations more than the pyramid's intrinsic nature. We see in the stones what our cultural moment allows us to see. The monument's silence, its lack of inscriptions explaining purpose or method, makes it infinitely interpretable, a Rorschach test for civilizational anxieties and aspirations. Yet beneath all interpretation, the stones endure. The pyramid is not primarily symbol or text, but object. 6 million tons of limestone and granite, arranged in geometric form that has resisted 4.5 millennia of weathering, earthquake, stone robbing, and human curiosity. That endurance is itself meaning, proof that human determination and engineering skill can create permanence, can impose order that outlasts empires, languages, and the memories of those who built. The pyramid's mass creates its own environment. The interior chambers maintain relatively stable temperatures year-round, despite extreme external variations. The enormous weight compresses the bedrock beneath, creating stresses that geologists can measure. The monument's footprint has altered local water tables, shifted sand dune patterns, created microclimates around its base. In this sense, the pyramid is not inert artifact, but active participant in its environment, still shaping the landscape, still affecting geology and ecology through mere presence. It demonstrates the long reach of intentional construction, decisions made 4,500 years ago about where to build and how to mass. Stone continue producing effects measurable today. But the weight is also metaphorical. The pyramid carries the accumulated weight of every interpretation, every theory, every story told about it. It bears the weight of mystery, all the questions it raises and refuses to definitively answer. It carries the weight of human mortality, standing as testament to our species' awareness that individual lives end, but works can persist. It bears the weight of time itself, stone embodiment of humanity's struggle against impermanence. Theories about the pyramid's age, purpose, and builders will continue evolving. Evidence will accumulate, methodologies will improve, cultural frameworks will shift. But the stones will remain, weathering slowly, losing mass grain by grain to wind and tourist hands, yet persisting as monument to persistence itself. Perhaps this is the deepest purpose the pyramid serves, not tomb or temple or astronomical instrument, but proof. Proof that humans, working with stone tools and muscle and organizational capacity, can create works that approach geological timescales. Proof that meaning can be carved into matter so durably that it survives the civilization that created it. Proof that the boundary between geological and historical time is permeable, that human intention, given sufficient mass and careful engineering, can enter the realm of mountains and continents, enduring alongside features we consider natural and eternal. 6 million tons is more than construction material. It's ambition made tangible, time made spatial, memory given weight that ensures its preservation regardless of whether anyone remembers what was meant. The pyramid stands. It will continue standing long after current debates about its origins are forgotten. And future humans, confronting its inexplicable presence, will ask the same questions we ask. Why? When? How? And what were they trying to tell us? The desert breathes again. Night returns to Giza as it has for millennia, darkness reclaiming the plateau, stars emerging with desert clarity, the wind moving across stones that have weathered under these same constellations for ages beyond counting. The tourists have departed, the floodlights dim, and the monuments stand as they stood when the only lights were cook fires and oil lamps, when the night sky was not competing with city glow, but blazed with the undimmed intensity that ancient eyes witnessed. Stand here, beneath the stars, and the pyramid reveals a different face. Not the sun-blasted tourist attraction of daylight, worn and graffitied and reduced to photo-op backdrop, but something older and stranger. A geometric shadow against the Milky Way, an artificial mountain that refuses to resolve into simple explanation. The longer you look, the more questions accumulate. Why this precision in an age of copper tools? Why these astronomical alignments in a structure supposedly built only as tomb? Why this location, this orientation, these proportions that encode mathematical relationships Bronze Age builders supposedly didn't understand? Why the absence of inscriptions when later pyramids are covered with text? Why do independent traditions, separated by centuries and cultures, all claim the monuments are older than official chronology allows? The questions don't invalidate Egyptology's careful reconstruction of 4th dynasty construction. The evidence for Khufu's involvement is substantial, multifaceted, and archaeologically sound. But the questions suggest layers, that what we call the Great Pyramid might be modification and completion of something earlier, that the astronomical knowledge it encodes might predate its final form by millennia, that the cultural knowledge enabling such precision might have roots extending back through Neolithic cultures into the Paleolithic skywatchers who first mapped constellations. History is not the straight line we teach in schools. It's spiral, recursive, full of lost knowledge and rediscovered wisdom, achievements that fade and are later reimagined by cultures that can barely comprehend what their predecessors accomplished. The Great Pyramid might be artifact of this spiral, pre-dynastic monument modified by dynasties that recognized its sacredness and power without fully understanding its origins, then reinterpreted by each subsequent era according to that era's intellectual frameworks. Or perhaps the monument is exactly what Orthodox archaeology claims: 4th dynasty tomb precisely dated and fully explained within Bronze Age cultural contexts, with its mysteries arising not from hidden antiquity, but from our tendency to underestimate what human patience and accumulated generational knowledge could achieve without modern technology. Both readings contain truth. Both honor different aspects of the evidence. And perhaps that ambiguity is itself the pyramid's deepest secret, that it resists singular interpretation, that it can be simultaneously tomb and temple and astronomical instrument and mathematical textbook and testament to human capability. That stone itself is polysemous, carrying meanings that change depending on who asks and when and what frameworks they bring to inquiry. The stars wheel overhead, tracking precessional cycles that dwarf human chronology. Orion rises in the east, belt stars arranged in pattern that may or may not be reflected in the monuments below. The pole star, Polaris now, but different stars in different epochs, marks true north with the same constancy that guided ancient builders when they aligned their structures. How many humans have stood on this plateau across the centuries, looked at these stones, and wondered? How many have projected their hopes, fears, and cosmologies onto limestone blocks that simply endure, indifferent to interpretation? How many more will come, millennia hence, when our own civilization is archaeology, and ask the same questions we ask now? The pyramid doesn't answer. It stands. It waits. It erodes at geological pace, while human theories rise and fall like dynasties, each convinced it has finally solved the mystery, each eventually replaced by new frameworks asking new questions. Perhaps this is wisdom, recognizing that some things resist complete understanding, that mystery is not problem to be solved, but condition to be appreciated. The pyramid's silence is not withholding, but offering space, room for wonder, for speculation, for the humility that comes from confronting works that exceed our ability to fully explain. The wind moves across the stones, same wind that carved the Sphinx's enclosure during epochs when Egypt received rain, same wind that dried the Sahara into desert, same wind that will eventually reduce even the Great Pyramid to sand and memory. But that erosion lies thousands or tens of thousands of years ahead. For now, the monument persists, question mark against the night sky, testament to ambition and skill and mystery. If you return here at dawn, watch how first light touches the eastern face, the pyramid emerging from darkness into visibility as humans have watched for 45 centuries. See how the geometry captures light, how the remaining casing stones at the apex still catch sun at angles.